The Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP as many people call it, was started in 1985 as a means to take marginal farmland, which was highly erodible actually, especially by wind, and put it into permanent grass cover. It's turned out to be a boon for wildlife habitat generally, but there are some things we can do to improve it for quail habitat specifically. As you look around here, you'll notice it's primarily a monoculture of a single species of grass. That's not necessarily good for quail. That's one of the challenges we have. Another is the shortage of shrubs. We have here an elm that's come up in this CRP field, which is a welcome thing. Brush sometimes, maybe often in livestock production, is considered something to be gotten rid of, but we want to see that coming in to CRP fields if we're thinking about quail management. They need these shrubs for loafing cover, for thermal protection, predator protection, and we also need those interspersed all through the CRP field, maybe at ideally 50-foot spacing or so. That might be wishing for quite a bit with some of these fields like this one where there's so few shrubs, but we're glad to have what we do have here. This is an elm that's been half cut. Limbs have been halfway sawed through and broken down, bent down toward the ground to provide more on the ground kind of cover for quail. As you know, an elm is typically an erect tree that has very little foliage down near the ground. So this half cutting practice is a good way to enhance the benefit of this shrub in a CRP field. I mentioned the monoculture of grass. Well, what do you do about that? And besides that, you can notice how dense it is around here. Many CRP fields are covered in one species of grass, a decadent, we call it a decadent population of grass. It's been growing for a long time, ungrazed, probably hasn't been burned, which is a tool that's really beneficial to us. So you've got a lot of old plant material at the base of the plant that's inhibiting any forbs from growing. It covers the ground like a solid cover of litter. So you think, what could you do with this challenge to increase it for the benefit for quail? You could mow it, you could shred it, but then that just adds to the litter on the ground, doesn't it? You could try to disc it or plow it. Again, you've got a huge problem with all this biomass. How are you going to get it underground and start decaying? Probably you'll want to think about things like burning, maybe even mob grazing. In other words, intentionally bringing in a lot of cattle at once so that they won't be able to pick and choose what they eat. They'll go ahead and just pretty well shave it off. That's not a long-term practice. That's just a one-time treatment. After that, you would want to use light to moderate grazing. But those disturbances like fire and grazing are what we need to try to increase forage production in this dense cover of grass. So we're missing a more diverse grass species that could enhance it through those kinds of disturbances. We're missing enough shrubs. We can allow shrub encroachment where previously we might try to get rid of shrubs coming back in. And we can use half cutting, for example, with some species like elm that aren't particularly useful to quail. Other species that may come into CRP fields might be mesquite, could be juniper or cedar, might be plum, but whatever you have in your area, be proud you have it. Wildlife shrub plantings are a good tool to consider when it comes to CRP that has a lack of shrubs. Some CRP fields don't have a lot of shrubs coming back in them. Here on the high plains, which is incidentally is where most of the CRP land is in the state of Texas, we don't have a lot of shrubs that come back into these CRP fields. Sometimes people that are really interested in giving a field a boost from a quail standpoint will plant aromatic sumac. It's been found to do well. I'm standing by one of those here. Plum, some of these species like that can be planted. The main thing to remember though is that you're going to have to irrigate them. You're going to have to take care of them for 2 or 3 years probably. Make sure you have a weed control mat on the ground, drip irrigation in place. It's not a inexpensive proposition. And as you can look down the line here, you'll see some of these trees, in spite of irrigation and good care over several years, have died anyway. So we do have some survivors though, and that's a good thing. Just be sure and use good farming practices, don't just put them out here and wish them well, because you won't have good results at all at that rate. It's sort of a drop in the bucket. You know, looking across the landscape, you realize this is not going to contribute a whole lot, but it is something. And it's something that some people do to, as I said, give things a jump start, get things going a little quicker. The Texas Forest Service has a nursery in Lubbock that provides what they call wildlife packets of seedlings that can be used for this purpose. That's where these trees came from. Commercial suppliers have those just as well. So check out what would be the best deal for you. But there's no shortage of seedling shrubs that can be used for purposes of quail management. Good loafing cover plants as well as food producing plants. Check that out and think about this as an option if it fits your objectives on your CRP. Weed control is important in establishing these shrub plantings. We have fabric on the ground here that got these seedlings up to the height you see now. You even see some little Illinois bundleflower here, which is a very good forb that's survived. But it would do some good to have less grass here mixed in with it so that it's not competing so much with these plants. You might accomplish that by fencing this out, as silly as that sounds, and using some kind of weed control till these shrubs get up a little bigger. Or you could count on some grazing, using grazing as a tool to knock this grass back a little bit. And if those cattle don't particularly favor the shrubs you've planted, they won't be browsing them, they will be eating the grass, and the shrubs will be able to do better with the lower grass height. Plus the quail could stand to have a lessened density of grass here also. One alternative to adding shrubs to your CRP is the construction of brush piles like you see here. It's not a primo living facility or loafing facility for quail, but it beats nothing, as you can imagine. So in some cases, like the landowner has done here, he has some materials and some brush he can pile up here and make a brush pile, a artificial, so to speak, structure that can provide some loafing cover, maybe some thermal protection from the cold as well as the heat. And as long as varmints don't take up residence there, it can be a decent substitute for a shrub. But it's not what you would want to aim for. It's something that you just may have to use because you don't have any alternatives. And it can be a good alternative in some situations like this, where there's just really sparse natural shrub cover. Strip disking is a good practice. Fall and winter disking alone can encourage forb production, which is a good thing for quail management. You get the seeds, you get the cover that's associated with them, and the diversity just from the seed bank that's in the soil. Now the high plains is typically a short grass prairie, which is blue grama and buffalo grass. Neither one of those grasses are particularly useful for quail. So this opportunity to modify some of this landscape as we manage CRP is a good opportunity to improve habitat for quail above actually what it was in its native state in a lot of this short grass prairie country. This is an area where disking was, actually plowing was done on a small area to try the treatment and see how it would work. They plowed about 2 acres here and then planted a wildlife seed mix of perennial grasses, native grasses, or grasses that were close to natives, close kin to natives. They used green sprangletop, they used yellow Indian grass, they used big blue stem, grasses such as that. They also put in some legumes such as Illinois bundleflower, forbs like purple prairie clover, alfalfa, and those legumes are very beneficial for building soil nitrogen as well as producing seeds for quail. And so we see here in this treatment trial done about 3 years ago a fair amount of success. We've opened up the ground where quail can travel better. Many of those grasses have survived. We definitely don't have a monoculture here on this treatment area. We have some species of weeds and forbs that have come back that weren't planted. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It increases the diversity. As long as those plants don't squeeze out what we've planted, we're happy to have those too. Another thing you can do is just disc strips across the field, maybe every 50 feet or so, and again take advantage, not just in a block like was done here, but in strips all the way across the field, maybe around the perimeter of the field. Again, take advantage of the native soil bank or plant seeds Here the landowner planted sunflowers in 50-foot strips, and the sunflowers have done pretty well, as you can see across the landscape. They've certainly increased the diversity of the plant community, and overall I think if you can put aside the cost, which I think ended up being pretty expensive for this landowner, he saw really good results here. If the cost can be reduced down to the point where you're able to stand it or you can justify it with your hunting operation, this is a real good practice for converting this CRP land into more useful state for quail. Again, you still need shrubs though. A diversity of forbs, diversity of grasses is nice for nesting cover, for feeding, for brooding, for insect production. But without those shrubs, you don't have good quail habitat, and you still need to address that in some fashion. Take advantage of what's coming up in your field, if that is the case, or you may want to think about planting some shrubs in the high plains. Now for a different perspective, a whole different part of the state, Dr. Dale Rollins, the director of the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch, is going to give his perspective on quail management on CRP.
Thanks, Ken. I'd like to tell our viewers now about the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch. Our CRP fields were put here in 1986, 87, so they're about 26 years old. They're out of the program now. We took them out in last September of 2012, to provide greater flexibility on what we can do relative to quail. You got to keep in mind that the weak link on most CRP fields is woody cover. So as we look across this CRP contract, we can see that the mesquites have been allowed to invade. We've come through here with a four-wheeler and IPT brush treatment, so we can take them out and basically sculpt those mesquites across the landscape like we'd like to see. We're still a little bit thin, but over time we'll be increasing the usable space out here for bob whites. We were also curious to know how valuable is this CRP grass for nesting cover. It occupies about 13% of our landscape here at the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch. Over the last 4 years, we've monitored 100 nests. 13 of them were in CRP, so they neither preferred it nor avoided it. But once the nest hatched, they didn't spend any more time in the CRP. Typically, they'd take their broods and go from here